was just past 10 p.m. in the quiet town of Clearwater, Alabama. The streets were wrapped in a soft mist, with streetlights casting a warm yellow glow across the wet pavement. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where neighbors trusted one another with everything from their lawnmowers to their children's school projects. The hum of the street lamps was almost a lullaby, lulling the town into a stillness that seemed unbreakable. But tonight, everything was about to change. In a gray sedan, 68-year-old Clara James drove slowly down Oakwood Drive, just a few blocks away from her home. She had just left a small vigil in honor of her late husband Charles, who had passed away only a week ago after more than 40 years of marriage. Clara, always composed, was struggling to keep it together as she drove through the familiar streets. The grief was there, just under the surface, like an unspoken weight that never quite lifted. The day had been hard, bittersweet, but tonight she had hoped to find a little peace. Clara's hands were steady on the wheel, her grip firm but not tight. She wore a navy dress and a soft gray coat, the same one she had worn to the funeral. Her white hair, neatly pinned up in a simple bun, shone under the streetlights. She had always carried herself with grace, the kind of woman who organized charity drives, volunteered at the church, and never once raised her voice in public, no matter how many times life gave her reasons to. But tonight something was different. As Clara turned onto Birchwood Avenue, her rearview mirror caught the flash of headlights. A police SUV. She didn't think much of it at first. It could have been anyone, just a patrol car heading the same way. But when she turned onto the next street and the SUV followed, her instincts kicked in. She had seen this before, many times. She was a black woman, and in America, no matter where you lived or how long you had been there, you learned to recognize when you were being watched. Clara's heart rate picked up, not from fear, but from an old familiar feeling. She flicked on her hazard lights and slowly pulled over to the curb, stopping just under the harsh glare of a streetlight. The police SUV came to a stop behind her, and Clara sat still, her breathing calm and controlled. She had done nothing wrong, but that had never guaranteed her safety. The sound of the SUV's door slamming shut echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Heavy boots crunched against the wet pavement as the officer approached her car, a flashlight beam cutting through the night, shining directly into Clara's face. The officer's voice was sharp, commanding, and completely void of any human warmth. "Driver, roll down your window," the officer barked. Clara complied slowly, her movements deliberate. She could feel the officer's eyes on her as she reached for her wallet and registration, placing them carefully on the passenger seat where they were clearly visible. She folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself. She had been stopped by police before, but tonight felt different. She wasn't just being pulled over for a simple traffic stop. She knew something deeper was at play. The officer, young, with blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail and a sharp jaw, approached the window. Her name was Officer Jenna Ford, and Clara had heard of her before, an ambitious young cop known for her strict, no-nonsense approach. As Officer Ford stared at Clara, she didn't reach for the documents right away. Instead, she lingered, studying Clara as though she were a problem to be solved, not a person to be served. "What brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" Officer Ford asked, narrowing her eyes. "I live here," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm, "just a few blocks away. I was at a vigil for my husband." There was a pause, a flicker of something in the officer's eyes, but Clara could see the doubt forming. "A vigil for my husband," she repeated, her voice steady. "He passed away last week." Clara didn't expect any sympathy. She had lived long enough to know better, but she had expected a basic level of respect, something simple, something human. Instead, Officer Ford's eyes narrowed even more. "He's out-of-state plates," the officer said slowly. "When did you move here?" 3 months ago, Clara replied, her patience thinning. "To be near my son." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, Clara saw her shift her stance, the tension in her shoulders rising. And that's when it happened, when Clara knew exactly what was going on. It wasn't about a traffic stop. It wasn't even about her car. This was about control. Officer Ford's voice sharpened. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Clara blinked in disbelief. "Is there a reason for that?" "Ma'am, step out of the car now," the officer demanded. And just like that, everything changed. The quiet night, the grieving widow, the woman who had lived through decades of hardship and service was now a suspect. It wasn't the first time Clara had been treated like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. Her hands remained steady as she opened the door, keeping her movements deliberate and slow. She wasn't afraid, but she knew the reality of the situation. This was the kind of confrontation that didn't end well for someone like her. The officer's flashlight beamed in her face, sharp and menacing. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Ford barked, her voice louder now as if trying to assert dominance. Clara complied, raising her hands slightly, not as a sign of submission but as a gesture of dignity. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother, a widow, a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice. But to Officer Ford, none of that mattered. Clara wasn't a person to her. She was a target, a symbol of something the officer wanted to control. Clara knew this wouldn't be a simple stop. The moment the officer demanded she step out of the vehicle, she realized this was just the beginning. It wasn't just a traffic violation, it was a moment that would change everything. She just didn't know yet how. Clara Ellis, calm and composed, stood there on the cold, damp street, her hands raised, palms facing the officer. She was used to the feeling this wasn't the first time she had been treated with suspicion. But tonight, something was different. There was an energy in the air, a tension that both Clara and the officer felt, even if they didn't fully understand it. The officer, Officer Jenna Ford, continued to shine her flashlight in Clara's face, her eyes scanning Clara's features as if searching for something that wasn't there. Clara knew the drill. She had been pulled over before, even more times than she could count, but this time something felt colder. Officer Ford's harsh tone, her rigid posture, the way she refused to let Clara's peaceful demeanor dictate the interaction, all of it screamed a deep, unsettling feeling of control. But Clara wouldn't give in. She stood there, dignified, refusing to be intimidated by the officer's presence or the flashing lights of the patrol car behind her. "I'm sorry, officer," Clara said, her voice steady, "but I have done nothing wrong. I've already given you my identification and registration." She looked the officer directly in the eyes. "You have no cause to arrest me." Officer Ford didn't respond right away. Instead, she circled around the car, her boots crunching against the wet concrete. Clara noticed how her body language shifted from aggressive to something colder, more calculating, as if she was waiting for Clara to make a mistake. The officer was testing her, hoping that Clara would slip up, show some weakness. But Clara wasn't just any woman. She had lived through far worse than this, and she wasn't about to be rattled by a younger officer's attempt at intimidation. "Where were you headed again?" Officer Ford's voice was sharp, her tone carrying that same forced suspicion. Clara took a breath. "I told you," she repeated calmly. "I'm heading home, just 2 blocks over. I was at a vigil for my late husband." The officer didn't seem to care for Clara's answer. She stopped circling the car and fixed her gaze on Clara, her eyes narrowing. "Why didn't you pull over sooner?" she asked, her voice growing colder. Clara's jaw clenched. She had no intention of letting this escalate further. "I wasn't aware that I needed to pull over sooner. You followed me. I stopped as soon as your lights went on." Officer Ford didn't seem to care about the facts. She wasn't interested in Clara's calm, rational explanation. Instead, she was digging in, trying to create a narrative where Clara was somehow guilty of something. "It's my word against yours," the officer muttered, as if that settled everything. Clara felt the familiar sting of being unfairly judged, but she refused to show it. "It's not about your word or mine, officer," she replied firmly. "I'm a law-abiding citizen. I've done nothing wrong." And that when Officer Ford's smirk appeared. the kind of smirk that suggested she had already made up her mind. There was no need for proof, no need for reason. Clara was simply a black woman in a white neighborhood, and in her eyes, that was enough. "Do you have anything in the car I should know about?" Officer Ford asked, her voice dripping with a false sweetness. "No," Clara answered quickly, her voice steady. "No drugs, no alcohol, no weapons." But it didn't matter. Clara knew it didn't matter. Officer Ford was looking for an excuse to escalate this, and the moment she found one, she would take it. That much was clear. The officer grabbed her radio, pressing the button with a practiced motion. "Dispatch, I'm on Sycamore and Cottonwood with a gray Lincoln, female driver out of state plates, claims she lives nearby, requesting backup." Clara's heart rate didn't quicken, but the irony didn't escape her. Backup? For what? A simple traffic stop? Clara had been a model citizen all her life. She had raised her children in this town, volunteered, worked hard, and yet tonight, in the eyes of Officer Ford, she was nothing but a suspect, a criminal. She was being treated as a threat when all she had done was drive home. "I haven't done anything wrong," Clara repeated, her voice calm but strong despite the chaos surrounding her. "There is no need for backup." But Officer Ford wasn't listening. She was already focused on creating a story where Clara was the problem, the one who needed to be controlled. And so she stood, her hand hovering near her holster, watching Clara closely. Seconds ticked by and the silence between them grew heavier. Then another squad car rolled up. Officer Ray Collins, an older officer with a gray mustache and a beer belly, stepped out. He didn't ask questions. He just walked over to Officer Ford. "What do we got?" he asked, his voice gruff but not harsh. "She's suspicious," Officer Ford replied, her tone cold. "Out-of-state plates. Didn't pull over right away." Clara felt the tightness in her chest. This wasn't a traffic stop anymore. It wasn't about whether she had swerved. It was about something deeper. Officer Ford had made up her mind the moment she saw Clara, a black woman, alone in a quiet neighborhood at night. The rest of the details didn't matter, only the assumption that Clara was a problem. Clara's posture remained straight, her hands still raised, steady. She wouldn't give the officers what they wanted. She wouldn't let them control her. But Officer Ford was relentless. "Ma'am, do you have any objection to us searching your vehicle?" she asked, her voice challenging. Clara didn't hesitate. "I do," she said firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong. You have no cause to search my vehicle." Officer Ford smirked. "We can get a warrant," she said, almost too casually. Clara met her gaze, unflinching. "Then do it." The moment those words left Clara's mouth, the dynamic shifted. Officer Ford realized she couldn't bully Clara into submission, but she wasn't ready to let this go. She stepped closer, too close, her flashlight now aimed directly at Clara's chest. "I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." Clara's heart sank. "For what?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "You're being detained for suspicion of obstruction." Clara's mind raced. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This wasn't even about her car. This was about something much deeper, something much older than her. This was about power, control. And tonight, Officer Ford had chosen her as the target. Clara stood there, unmoving, as Officer Ford grabbed her arm and attempted to turn her toward the car. She didn't resist. She wouldn't. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. She knew deep down that this moment wouldn't end the way Officer Ford thought it would. She had buried a husband, raised a mayor, and fought for change when others were too afraid to speak. This moment, this injustice, was only the beginning. As Clara stood there, handcuffed and restrained against the cold metal of her car, the weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. Her breathing remained steady, her posture resolute, but beneath the calm exterior, a storm brewed. Familiar, painful, but not unfamiliar. She'd faced injustice before, As a black woman, she had experienced too many encounters like this, where the color of her skin was enough to make her a target. But this moment was different. This time, she wouldn't be silenced. This time, the consequences would echo louder than ever before. Officer Ford stood by, her posture rigid, her eyes narrowed, as though hoping Clara would react, yell, scream, protest. But Clara wouldn't give her the satisfaction. No, she was going to make sure this moment wasn't just another routine abuse of power. This wasn't just about Clara. It was about something much bigger. The officers didn't know who they were dealing with, and soon they'd find out. "You're being detained for suspicion of obstruction," Officer Ford repeated, her voice laced with arrogance. Clara didn't flinch. "You've got no reason to detain me," she said quietly, her voice firm but without the slightest tremor of fear. The officer seemed to take offense at her calmness, as though Clara should have been trembling in fear. But Clara had lived through so much more than this. She had buried her husband, led her community, and raised a son who had gone on to become the mayor. Tonight, this small town would learn that Clara Ellis was not someone to be underestimated. The sirens wailed in the distance, the cold air pressing against Clara's skin, but still, she stood tall, not a single movement betraying the rising tension in the air. Officer Ray Collins, the second officer, stood back, observing the situation with an almost nonchalant air. He didn't ask questions, didn't seem interested in hearing the truth. He just nodded along with whatever Officer Ford said. "Let's just take her in," Officer Ford said, her voice cutting through the night. Clara's mind raced as she processed the words. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a system that had allowed officers like Ford to act with impunity. She had worked her entire life, never breaking the law, always maintaining the dignity that her mother had instilled in her. But it didn't matter. She knew this fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the officers led her to the squad car, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists, Clara's thoughts drifted to the vigil she had attended just hours before. The soft candlelight, the words of remembrance for her late husband, Robert Ellis, a man who had fought tirelessly for civil rights, who had spent his life making the world a better place. She felt his presence in that moment, even as the officers' harsh treatment sought to erase her sense of self-worth. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know her legacy. Inside the police station, things moved with a quiet efficiency. Officers passed by, heads down, murmuring among themselves. The usual small-town atmosphere had shifted. Everyone knew that something wasn't right, but no one spoke up. Not yet. Clara was led into a small, sterile holding room. The silence was deafening. She sat on the cold metal bench, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had left marks. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. She had been through worse, far worse. The feeling of helplessness didn't come naturally to her, and she wasn't going to let it take over now. Minutes ticked by, then Officer Ford walked in. She looked Clara over, still wearing that same look of smug authority. She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "We'll try this again," Ford said coldly, her voice laced with frustration. "Name?" "Clara Ellis," Clara answered, her voice even. "And your address?" 1432 Oak Street, 2 blocks from where you stopped me," Clara said, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. Ford wrote it down, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Clara. "You've got out-of-state plates. Why didn't you get a local driver's license?" Clara remained calm. "I applied for one. The Oregon DMV is backed up. My Georgia license is still valid." Ford's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. She wasn't interested in the facts. She was looking for a reason to justify the way she had treated Clara, and Clara knew it. "Why did you move here?" Ford asked, her voice now sharper than before. "To be near my son," Clara replied, not missing a beat. Officer Ford seemed to hesitate for a moment before continuing. "What does your son do?" Clara paused just a moment before answering. "He's in city business." It wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the whole truth. Clara's son was the mayor of Silver Creek, a public figure, and while he wasn't in town at that moment, his presence was about to change everything. Ford stared at her, clearly expecting more, but Clara wasn't giving up any more than she had to. She wasn't about to make things easier for her captors. Behind the scenes, things were starting to shift. Officer Miguel Torres, a longtime member of the force, was quietly reviewing footage from the night's events. His mind was racing as he watched the video from Jim Hartley's phone. The same footage that was now circulating. Clara Ellis hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was being treated like a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of everyone. Torres knew that what had happened wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern, one that needed to be addressed. "Do you know who she is?" Torres asked Sergeant Daniels, his voice tight with disbelief. Daniels, a veteran officer, looked up at the screen. He nodded slowly. "She's the mother of the mayor." Torres's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This wasn't just about a black woman being treated unfairly. This was about the entire town, the entire police department, and the way they viewed people who weren't like them. And Torres knew that they couldn't ignore it anymore. Meanwhile, in the holding room, Clara sat alone, reflecting on her life. The injustice she was facing felt familiar, but it wouldn't break her. She had spent years fighting for change, and she wasn't about to stop now. Officer Ford might have thought this was the end of Clara's story, but Clara knew better. She had been through too much to let a simple traffic stop define her. Just as the tension in the room reached its peak, Clara's phone rang. It wasn't hers, it was the station's line. She could hear a calm, controlled voice on the other end, Mayor Julian Ellis's voice. "This is Mayor Julian Ellis," the voice said. "My mother has been detained at your station. I expect an immediate explanation." And in that moment the world shifted. The system that had worked so hard to keep Clara in her place was about to face the reckoning it had been avoiding for far too long. As the cold metal cuffs tightened around Clara's wrists, a familiar feeling washed over her. Not fear, but something much deeper. It was the weight of injustice, one she'd carried for most of her life. She was calm, not because she wasn't affected, but because she had learned long ago that remaining composed in moments like these was the only way to maintain her dignity. She had seen this before. Black women being profiled, questioned without reason, and humiliated by those who held power. But this time it was different. This time the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. Officer Haley Dunn stood across from Clara, her eyes sharp and full of suspicion. She wasn't interested in hearing Clara's side. She had already made up her mind. From the moment she pulled Clara over, it was clear to her that this was just another case of a woman thinking she could get away with something, thinking that her age or appearance would shield her from scrutiny. Clara's calmness only made Haley more suspicious. She was acting too composed, too defiant in the face of authority, and to Haley that made her an even bigger threat. "You're being detained for suspicion of obstruction," Officer Dunn declared, her voice full of authority. She was trying to assert control, trying to bend Clara's will with her harsh tone, but Clara refused to bend. "Obstruction? I haven't done anything wrong," Clara replied, her voice even, unwavering. Her calmness irritated Haley even more. She wasn't used to people standing up to her like this, especially not someone who looked like Clara. But Clara knew better. She had spent years fighting for change in her community, working tirelessly for civil rights, and raising her son, now the mayor of Silver Creek. She had seen it all, the systemic racism, the prejudice, and the indifference from those in power. But Clara had learned how to navigate through it all, how to remain strong even in the face of adversity. And tonight, this wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger. The officers continued to question her, their interrogation growing more invasive by the minute. "Where were you headed?" Haley demanded, her flashlight shining directly into Clara's face. It was an attempt to unnerve her, to make her uncomfortable, to force her to break. But Clara wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "I told you. I'm just heading home," Clara replied, her voice steady. She knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted her to react, to get defensive, to show any sign of weakness. But Clara wasn't going to let them win. Haley's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," she ordered, her tone growing more authoritative. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason for that?" Haley didn't answer. Instead, she repeated, "Step out of the car, now." Clara's heart rate picked up ever so slightly, but she wasn't afraid. This was just another chapter in a story she had been living for far too long. She had seen the way people like Haley treated others, especially people who looked like her, and she wasn't going to let it slide this time. With deliberate slowness, Clara unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door, stepping out onto the damp pavement. The cold air bit at her skin, but she remained still, her hands raised slightly to show that she posed no threat. She knew how dangerous it could be for someone like her in a situation like this. Any wrong move, any perceived threat, and things could escalate quickly. But she wasn't going to give them that opportunity. Haley stepped closer, her hand hovering near her holster, her flashlight aimed squarely at Clara's chest. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Haley barked, her voice sharp. The sound of her command echoed through the quiet night, the fog around them carrying the harshness of her words. But Clara stood her ground. "I'm not a threat," Clara said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just a woman trying to get home." But Haley wasn't listening. She circled Clara's car, inspecting it like a predator stalking its prey, searching for any sign of wrongdoing, any excuse to escalate the situation. "Where were you headed again?" she asked, her tone dripping with suspicion. "I told you," Clara repeated, her voice steady. "Home. 2 blocks over." But that wasn't enough for Haley. She stopped walking, her eyes narrowing. "Why didn't you pull over sooner?" she asked, her voice cold, accusatory. Clara clenched her jaw. "I wasn't aware I needed to," she said, her patience starting to wear thin. "You followed me. I stopped when your lights came on." But Haley wasn't done. She wanted to prove something, to make Clara submit, to show her who was in control. "You were swerving," Haley accused, her words laced with contempt. "I was not," Clara responded, her voice barely rising above a whisper. She was done explaining herself. She had done nothing wrong. But Haley wasn't interested in the truth. The situation was escalating, and Clara could feel it. She had been here before in situations like this where the law didn't protect her, where the system was rigged against people who looked like her. But Clara wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Then, from across the street, Jim Hartley, a retired firefighter who had been watching the scene unfold from his porch, knew something wasn't right. He grabbed his phone and started recording. He had seen too many moments like this, too many instances where the truth had been ignored or twisted. He wasn't going to let this one go unnoticed. As Haley stood over Clara, her hand still hovering near her holster, Clara remained composed, standing tall, refusing to give in to the intimidation. She had faced worse in her life. This was just another battle, another moment of reckoning. But this time it would be different. The world was watching, and the truth would not be buried. The video Jim recorded would soon be the catalyst for everything that was about to unfold. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was the beginning of a reckoning, and Clara Ellis was ready to make sure the world would listen. The officers might have thought they were in control, but Clara was about to show them just how wrong they were. The situation in the police station was tense. Officer Haley Dunn walked through the sterile halls, trying to regain some sense of control, but inside everything was unraveling. She had just detained Clara Ellis, a woman she had profiled based on nothing but her own prejudices. In her mind, Clara was just another suspect, just another person she could assert her authority over. But deep down, Haley knew something wasn't sitting right. Clara had done nothing wrong. Still, she walked with purpose, determined to push forward, despite the nagging voice inside her head. When she entered the holding room, Clara was sitting calmly, still composed, her back straight, her eyes clear and unwavering. She had been through this before, and the exhaustion of it all, of living in a system designed to humiliate people like her, hadn't broken her. She was a widow, a mother, and a fighter, and her dignity was something no one could take away from her. Clara wasn't the kind of woman who would crumble under pressure. Even now, as her body ached from the handcuffs, she stayed strong. Her mind was already moving ahead, thinking of the many ways she could make this moment count, how she could use her position and her story to bring about change. The world needed to know what happened here in Silver Creek, in the quiet town where the streets were usually so peaceful. But peaceful meant silence, and Clara had lived long enough to know that silence often allowed injustice to thrive. Haley's shift was over, but her thoughts were still on Clara. What had she really seen in the woman? Was Clara truly a threat, or had she been caught up in something much bigger than herself? Haley wasn't sure anymore. Her own actions were now coming into sharp focus. She had been taught that authority meant dominance, but Clara's quiet resistance, her unwavering composure, had left her questioning everything. In the holding room, Clara sat still, a sense of calm radiating from her. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with. Clara Ellis wasn't just another black woman. She was the mother of the mayor of Silver Creek. And now, her son was about to make sure that the world knew the truth. Meanwhile, outside, the tension was mounting. The video Jim Hartley had recorded was circulating, and soon the entire town would know what had happened. Jim had recorded Clara with the intent to document what he saw, but what he had captured was much more than a mere interaction. It was evidence of something far more insidious, something systemic. As the video made its way through the small town, the realization set in. Clara Ellis was not just an ordinary woman. She was a force, a presence in Silver Creek who had seen it all, from the marches to the fights for civil rights to raising her son in the face of adversity. Her fight wasn't just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of injustice. In the police station, things were about to escalate. Officer Ray Collins walked in, an older man with gray hair and a weary look in his eyes. He wasn't the type to get involved in drama, but something about this didn't sit right with him. As he reviewed the video that had been circulating, he couldn't deny it. Clara had been mistreated. The video didn't lie. There she was, calm and composed, treated like a criminal simply because of her race, while Haley's authority was built on a foundation of bias. The next morning, Chief Raymond Holstead was facing a crisis. The community was in an uproar and the pressure was mounting. When he received the call from Julian Ellis, Clara's son, the reality of the situation hit him hard. The mayor of Silver Creek was on the other end of the line, demanding answers. Julian's voice was calm but firm, and Holstead could hear the underlying anger that had been building for years, the same anger that had shaped Julian's entire life. "Get my mother out of there, now!" Julian's voice was clear. Holstead knew that this wasn't just about Clara, it was about the entire community. The video had gone viral, and now everyone was watching, waiting for the town's leaders to do something about it. Haley, still processing the events, was in her apartment, scrolling through the messages, the social media posts, the news coverage. The weight of the truth was finally settling in. She had always thought she was doing her job, upholding the law, but the more she watched the footage, the more she realized she had failed, not just as an officer, but as a human being. Her actions had been driven by something deeper than protocol. It had been driven by her own biases, her own fears, and her desire to hold control over someone she perceived as other. Back at the station, Holstead wasted no time. He knew that this was no ordinary case. Clara's arrest was not just an incident, it was a moment of reckoning for the entire town. As Holstead stood in front of Clara in the holding room, he knew that this would be a turning point in Silver Creek's history. "I'm releasing you now," Holstead said, his voice steady. The cuffs were removed from Clara's wrists, and she stood up slowly, her body aching from the strain, but her spirit as unbroken as ever. Outside, the world was waiting. Clara's story had sparked something that could no longer be ignored. As the video continued to circulate, the community of Silver Creek was beginning to realize that they had to face the truth about their police department, their town, and the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester for far too long. But Clara, now free from the immediate physical constraints, wasn't thinking about what had just happened. She was thinking about the long-term impact of this moment. She knew that this would not be the end, but the beginning of something much bigger. Her son, Julian, would help ensure that the changes necessary for true justice would take root, not just in Silver Creek, but across the country. This wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about accountability. As Clara stepped out of the holding room, she glanced at the officers who had been involved in her detainment. None of them could look her in the eye. And in that moment, Clara knew that the system would change, not because of any one individual, but because the people like her, were finally standing up and refusing to be silent. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the story of Clara Ellis unfolds, it's clear that what started as an unjust moment of racial profiling and harassment grew into something much larger, something that transcended just one arrest. It became a powerful symbol of how systemic injustice can break a community, but also how it can be rebuilt through courage, resilience, and accountability. Clara's quiet dignity in the face of mistreatment, her unwavering strength, and her refusal to be broken set in motion a chain of events that exposed the truth, revealed the biases hiding within the system, and sparked a movement that Silver Creek will never forget. But this wasn't just Clara's story, it's all of ours. It's a reminder that when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice, we can bring about real change. The fight for justice isn't about grand gestures or fighting fire with fire. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply standing your ground, speaking your truth, and demanding accountability. The impact of Clara's actions extends far beyond her town. It has inspired countless others to speak up for what's right, to challenge the systems that fail them, and to ensure that justice, dignity, and respect are upheld for everyone, no matter their race, background, or status. This story teaches us that when we see something wrong, we don't just look away, we act. We challenge, we question, and we refuse to let history repeat itself. Clara's legacy isn't just about exposing a moment of injustice, it's about creating a lasting change that will help future generations find their own voice, just as she did. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the power of standing up and speaking out, let us know. Comment 1 if you like the video and comment 0 if you think there's room for improvement, so I can continue making content that truly speaks to you. Your feedback is invaluable to me, and together we can keep pushing for a world where stories like Clara's don't have to be retold, but where real change is the norm. Thank you for watching. Remember, it's never too late to stand up for what's right.